All right, well, everybody, welcome back to our next lesson and actually final kind of major lesson in this unit on urban geography, which really centers on issues with shaping urban areas in the core, especially within the United States of America. And, many of the issues with shaping urban areas in the core really go back to decades of history that set the stage for segregation. Uh, During the segregation era in the United States, realtors, financial lenders, city governments defined and segregated spaces in urban environments. For example, before the 1960s, financial institutions in the business of lending money, basically mortgage lenders, could engage in a practice that was known as redlining. And so essentially, what they would do is they would identify what they considered to be risky neighborhoods and cities, aka African American neighborhoods, basically, and refuse to offer loans to anyone purchasing a house in that neighborhood that was encircled by red lines on their maps. They would also refuse working with anyone that wanted to improve on their house, to take out or to do like a big remodeling project in a home oftentimes requires a loan as well. And those would be refused in these redlined areas as well. Take a look at this map of the city of Atlanta. This goes back to the 1930s. And what you're looking at here are these red spaces. And notice how it's right around the incidentally, I'm just going to show this to you here. I want to mark this. This is pretty interesting to see. This is Atlanta's CBD right here. Yeah. And notice what surrounds Atlanta's CBD. A zone of transition, right? And in the case of Atlanta, African American neighborhoods, and all of them surrounding the CBD were redlined for further development in the 1930s. Again, basically, this is banks refusing to offer loans to anyone that would purchase a home or try to improve on a home in this particular neighborhood, or any of these that are in red. Really, really fascinating. So this practice, of course, worked against those living in poor neighborhoods, and it helped to precipitate sort of a downward spiral in which poor neighborhoods became increasingly run down because funds weren't available for upkeep. Again, you need loans to remodel houses, and funds were not available to purchase homes for sale. So the practice again is called redlining, and this is at the heart of so many of the problems of American cities, even in the 21st century. Before the civil rights movement, realtors could actually purposefully sell a house in a white neighborhood at a very low price to a black buyer, and they would use that to get the rest of the neighborhood to sell. The practice was called block busting. Basically, realtors would solicit white residents of a neighborhood to sell their houses under the fear that the neighborhood was going downhill because of a black person or a black family that had moved in. Essentially, there's some more redlined areas in Atlanta. Essentially, the idea was, hey, your property values are going to go down because this African American family lives in your neighborhood, so sell now while you don't lose everything. Of course, African Americans moving into a neighborhood does not bring down property values. What does, though, is a bunch of for sale signs. So it sort of ended up becoming the self-fulfilling prophecy in a way. And this caused an issue that we've talked about before. It caused white flight to the suburbs, while the land got sold to developers who didn't maintain the land very well. And that led to values of homes dropping even more, values in neighborhoods dropping even more when these sold homes got sold to developers that just didn't really maintain the land very well. A lot of times, what ended up happening is that neighborhoods fell victim to what we call filtering, which is basically when you take a single family house and then you subdivide it into these rented apartments. And generally, what you would see in these cases is they would subdivide these houses into rental apartments. the landlords were pretty much absentee landlords. They just really cared about collecting rent and not the upkeep of the property. And so these areas fell into disrepair. And so, again, this is in so many ways at the root of a lot of issues. And you got to think about this. I'm going to post a video from NPR on the blog post for today where you can see this, where it talks about some of the effects of redlining and blockbusting that still continue to this day, not just on property values, but on the health of people, on people's wealth, on policing of neighborhoods, on the quality of schools. Remember that schools are funded by property taxes, right? So if property values have gone through the floor, how is that going to affect school systems in these areas that were redlined? You know, obviously they're going to be pretty poor, and that's just going to continue to affect property values in a negative way as well. It'll just have kind of a negative effect on these neighborhoods. The other problem with white flight specifically and suburbanization as a whole, a lot of times for central cities, has been that city governments end up losing tax revenue because a lot of the people that left were middle class and upper class taxpayers that left the city, and they brought their tax revenue with them to the suburbs instead. And this is going to create a lot of budget shortfalls in a lot of American cities. Now, in recent years, in order to try to counter this trend, city governments have been encouraging the commercialization of city centers and also what we call gentrification in and around the CBD. Gentrification, GENTRIFICATION. Basically, gentrification, what it is the process of converting a neighborhood from predominantly low-income renters to predominantly middle-class owners is the idea. And, this usually starts with, you have a group of, people that buy houses low, either have the money to remodel them or are able to do it themselves or have the money to pay somebody to do it for them, oftentimes. And basically flip the house and then sell it off and turn a profit, right? Because by remodeling the home, they've upped the property value of that home, and now they'll sell it to a middle class resident and make some money doing that. And in a lot of ways, people ended up becoming attracted. I mean, this trend really kicks off in the 1990s and throughout the 2000s, the early 2000s. But people are attracted to move into a town. Or I'm sorry, let me rephrase that. That people are oftentimes attracted to move into town by city governments that are going to provide low cost loans and tax breaks to get them to come in and make it worth their while. Part of gentrification is to clean up city streets, sidewalks, and buildings, tear down old abandoned buildings, build up commercial offerings and residents in place of that. And so, if you take a look at this next visual, you can see a neighborhood that's been gentrified. In this case, you see a house in the old photograph that's been completely torn down, and what would almost be like a suburban middle class home, or a suburban style middle class home being built in the middle of the city in its place, right? So you get an idea what gentrification looks like there. This is right here in Atlanta. You see, the difference between the residence, which is basically an apartment building on the left, and then this new home that just got built right next to it, right? Part of the process of gentrification of a neighborhood. And a lot of times, part of gentrification, as I just mentioned, is also the commercialization of a neighborhood, transforming it into like sort of an attractive area for tourists and for residents alike by building marketplaces, building parks, building amusement zones, sports stadiums, etc. I mean, we've even seen this to a certain degree right inside Atlanta's CBD with a lot of the development that we've seen here in recent years. The problem, though, with like downtown Atlanta, like the neighborhood that you're looking at here, is that tourists have been attracted to the area, but not necessarily permanent residents, which is what the areas really need in order to start kind of building up, a great tax base. Now, one of the things that you do have to understand is that demographic transition in a lot of ways affects the move back to the city. And the reason why is that in the later stage of demographic transition where we're at, people have smaller families or sometimes just not even having kids at all. And so there's been more movement into the city to gentrify during recent years because of the growing number of childless couples and single people who don't want to live in the suburbs. They don't want to do the commute. They do want to live in the city and they don't have children. So, they don't have to really worry about the quality of inner city schools. All they're thinking about is living near, central attractions, the nightlife of the city, all the amenities that the city gets you, right? But you're not really thinking about schools so much because maybe you don't have kids in the first place, right? Also, a lot of the houses that you're going to see as part of the gentrification process in the inner city are going to be larger and more substantially constructed and less expensive a lot of times than houses in the suburbs, at least initially until property values start going up. And so for people who work downtown, inner city living eliminates the strain of commuting on crowded freeways or on public transit or whatever. This is a big deal for a lot of people that are attracted in to neighborhoods that are gentrifying. The biggest consequence, though, of gentrification is, in the end, increased housing prices in central city neighborhoods. The problem with increased housing prices is as property values rise, so do property taxes. And so a lot of times lower income residents simply just get priced out of the area. They just can't any longer afford to live there, which leads in many cases to the growing problem of homelessness and just in a lot of ways, just like an overall bad taste in people's mouths for gentrification in the first place. You see a little protest going on here in the next visual against the gentrification happening in a neighborhood in an American city, right? And people essentially getting priced out of a neighborhood that maybe they've been in for their entire lives or maybe multiple generations. That said, though, gentrification sort of becomes necessary in order to combat population decline of cities and just overall abandonment of inner city neighborhoods that sometimes occurs. You're looking here at a street in what was once the bustling city of Detroit. In 1950, the population of Detroit was 1.8 million residents. Now the population is just over 700,000. It's literally dropped by half. And then the mayor of Detroit announced in the year 2010 a plan to demolish 10,000 abandoned buildings and houses in Detroit by 2014. And that's exactly what happened. And so now the city's trying to figure out how to shut down and close off entire neighborhoods because it can't afford to pay for streetlights in neighborhoods that are mostly abandoned. They can't afford to pay for garbage pickup, for police protection for the entire city because, again, tax revenue dried up. So it's city of Detroit's actually encouraging the handful of people still living in sparsely inhabited neighborhoods to just move out of the neighborhoods entirely, abandon them so we can knock these neighborhoods like you see in the visual down, turn it into green space, and then basically control just more concentrated areas of the city of Detroit. Of course, the problem is much more widespread than Detroit. Many inner city neighborhoods that once housed 100,000 people back in the day now contain fewer than 5,000 people living in them. This is a recent American problem. And really, the automobile killed the dominance of the CBD, as we've talked about before. And so central cities lost their primary situational advantage in a lot of cases and the foundation of their internal land use patterns. The central city in so many places is now viewed as this aging, congested, and inefficient place. And once vibrant industrial districts, have become, left behind as blighted, contaminated, and polluted sites that we call brownfields. And you're looking at a brownfield here in the picture. Now, of course, there is a movement to try to remediate brownfields in most major cities. Atlanta, for example, has brownfield programs, and the Beltline project has been one of those around the Atlanta Beltline. If you're in the Ponce City Market,